You've had a lot of welcome so far, but I'd like to extend that welcome on behalf of the Institute to you all. If you've been involved with BBI previously, through studying with us, teaching with us, or through attending one of our events, welcome back. If it's your first contact with the Institute, welcome for the first time, and we hope it's the first time of many times. You've come to a special place which has at its heart theological education, and significantly given our topic this evening, theological education which is accessible to all. This happens in two areas: at the tertiary level in partnership with the University of Newcastle, and as part of our professional and continuing education series of lectures and seminars, including this evening's wonderful event. There's more information about our institute in those packs you've been given, and without any further delay, I'd like to introduce our wonderful lecturer this evening. John Swinton is Professor of Practical Theology and Pastoral Care at the School of Divinity, Religious Studies and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. I didn't say that right.
No, you didn't.
I can explain it later, John.
Scotland, roll your R's.
He has a background in mental health, nursing and healthcare chaplaincy, and also serves as an honorary professor and researcher at Aberdeen's Centre for Advanced Studies in Nursing. John has researched and published extensively within the areas of practical theology, mental health, spirituality and human well-being, and the theology of disability. Professor Swinton is an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland and Director, Centre of Spirituality, Health and Disability, the University of Aberdeen, not even going to try that term, and co-director the Kairos Forum. He's a member of the Autism Spectrum People and Religion Research Group. Professor Swinton's research interests include practical theology, pastoral care, qualitative research methods, nursing, ministry, healthcare chaplaincy, multidisciplinary education and research. John is the author or editor of 14 books, over 20 journal articles, and has presented all over the world. And somehow amidst all of that has found time to be here with us this evening. So thank you, John, for your presence here this evening. And without further delay, we'd like to welcome you.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's actually the first time I've ever been in Sydney, and it's a really beautiful city. I've been in lots of different cities, but this has been a really nice city. I took a ferry to Manly in the sunshine. You guys think this is winter, don't you? What a laugh. It's great, so I'm happy to be here. What I'd like to talk to you about tonight really is the theology of disability. The theology of disability is a way of looking at God and human beings from a perspective that's oftentimes overlooked. So if you think about what theology is, basically the study of God, who does it normally? Well, it's normally done in places like this, or in institutions like my own, which is oftentimes by middle-class white men, sometimes women, but not if men can stop that from happening. And so it's created in a very particular environment. But when you're sitting in your office and you're thinking about the Christian tradition, and you're thinking about history, and you're thinking about practice, there's only a certain number of questions you're going to come up with, isn't it? You're going to be bounded by your sexuality, by your age, by your knowledge, all of these different things. What the theology of disability does is says there are other questions that need to be asked of the Christian tradition. There are other voices that need to be taken in seriously and taken into consideration. And the voices of people with disabilities bring new questions to the table. So it's not that we create a whole new tradition, but it means that when you listen to different voices, you see different things. And so the theology of disability is a new way of listening and a new set of questions that it ends up giving us a new way of seeing. So I want just to kind of explore and look around some of the ways in which that works itself out in terms of practice, in terms of the way we see the world. Because the place I'd like to begin is with a strange place. This is a picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for some of you who know this, was a Lutheran pastor who was martyred during the last World War because of his position against the Nazi regime. But what you might not know is that Bonhoeffer's ministry and Bonhoeffer's theology was profoundly impacted by his experience in a small community in Germany called Bethel. And that community was a community of people with disabilities. It was a community that gathered around that had people with disabilities, that had homeless people, that had people who had epilepsy, all who gathered in this small village to worship together. And Bonhoeffer would go down there and he'd worship with this huge diversity of people, people whom society kicked around and rejected. And what he discovered as he began to hang around with people with disabilities was that everything that he thought he knew about the church was challenged. And everything that was going on in Germany at that time in relation to the church was challenged. The church wasn't intended to be a big place of power and a big place of control and a big place of normalization in a very particular way, which is what the Nazi regime was about. The church was a special place, he said, where the vulnerable become strong. And what he saw in Bethel was a vision of the kingdom. He saw a place where the church really was exposed as the church. A place of defenselessness, a place of vulnerability, a place of embodied neighbourly love, as he put it. And that vision transformed his understanding, because what he saw was a picture that the Nazi regime was painting of a superhuman being. And what he began to see was that this picture of a superhuman being was a form of madness. And that the way human beings really is captured in the experience of worshipping with those whom society chooses to put to one side. So he gives a very special and very particular understanding of what a church community looks like. And that was formative in the way that he developed his theology as he began to move on. Now, Bonhoeffer lost his life. Now, at one level you could say, well, he failed. You could even say that, well, clearly God was on the side of the Nazis. But this is the way that Bonhoeffer, I think, would frame the question. He would say, the task of the church is not to be successful or powerful. The task of the church is to be faithful to those tasks that are given to them. And there's something fundamentally important in relation to disability theology. The task of disability theology is not necessarily to transform the world through politics, economics, and worldly power, but to be faithful to the task that is given to them. And the task that's given to the disability theologian is to help us to see properly what it means to be a human being. Help us to understand that many of the things that we're taught by culture are false, and that to be human is much more interesting and much more complicated than the simplistic way in which culture tells us it should be. So I want us just to kind of try and draw out some of that stuff. The place I want to begin with is we need to start from the right place if we're going to explore any human experience. What's the right place to begin when we're talking about disability? One of the temptations we have is to take definitions from, I don't know, medicine or from politics or economics and use these as our beginning points for exploring what disability is. I want to suggest we put that to one side and we begin in a different place. And to illustrate that, think about it in this way, in the context of a theological perspective, if you like. One of the things that we oftentimes don't notice is that when you look at the Genesis account of creation, God does lots of things. He creates human beings, obviously. He gives them particular responsibilities. He gives them dominion. He asks them to care for the world. But one thing that we don't necessarily notice is that he gives Adam the responsibility to name things. So all of the animals come before Adam, and he gives them names. And as soon as he gives them names, they become that thing. In other words, the act of naming brings into existence something new, something real, and something different. And when it comes to issues of disability, it's really important that we name things properly. Because a primal responsibility of being to be a human being is to name things properly. And one of the problems in the conversations that go around disability is that we misname things. And when we misname things, we end up with stigma, alienation, false names. So the beginning point for a good theology of disability is to name things properly. Let me illustrate this to you. What we believe about the world will determine how we look at it. How we look at the world will determine how we name it, and how we name something in the world will determine how we respond to it. So naming things properly is really, really important. Think about it this way in the context, for example, of mental health. Diagnosis. And it says here, I've done a thorough examination, and it's safe to say that there's absolutely no sign of goodness in you. That's a Presbyterian definition of a diagnosis. And I like it. But what's a diagnosis? Think about it. A diagnosis occurs when someone has a strange set of experiences, or something happens that's different to them, their body changes or their mind changes. They then take that experience, take it in the context of mental health, they take that experience to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist then filters their experience down through the various theoretical frameworks that they have to make sense of that, and then gives a diagnosis, i.e. gives a person a name. Now the problem with that kind of diagnosis is not that they're not necessarily unhelpful. The problem is that once you have a diagnosis, that becomes your name. So as soon as your experiences are interpreted as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or whatever it is, that becomes your name. If you have influenza, people don't call you Mr. or Mrs. Flu. But if you have schizophrenia, people begin to call you a schizophrenic. And as soon as you're a schizophrenic, you're often a really strange social tangent, not because of your illness, but because of the way that people perceive and understand that particular name and way of naming things. But think about it this way, who are diagnoses for? Now, diagnosis in any context is something that the medical professions or the psychiatric professions use to enable them to help to understand the stories that you give to them in a very particular perspective, with a view to then enabling them to use their particular healing expertise to help you to deal with this experience, or maybe even to eradicate this experience. In other words, a diagnosis is only for mental health professionals. It's not meant for you and I. It's not meant for a minister, a priest, or anybody else. It's intended for one particular group of people that society has put to one side to deal with certain experiences, to enable them to do their job well. And there's nothing wrong with that. But diagnoses are not for you and I, unless you're a mental health professional. They're not the way in which, or not the only way in which particular experiences can be named, and indeed they shouldn't be. So if we begin our journey as lay people with diagnosis and all of the social stigma that surrounds that, then we're beginning in the wrong place. Now, if you're a mental health professional, that's a good place to begin, because that's what you're intended to do. But if you're a pastor or a pastoral carer, it may not be the best place to begin. There are other places that you can begin. There are other stories that you can tell about the particular experiences that people have. And one of the problems with diagnoses is that they are stories that you can't get rid of, and you lose your story in the midst of that. So no matter how much you shout and say, that's not my story, this is my story, it's very difficult to get it back. Let me give you an example. I have a friend who from her early teens had schizophrenia, was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she had significant hallucinations, delusions, behavioural issues, and had a very, very difficult life. Then she came to the age of 19, I think if I remember correctly, and it stopped. Now she says that the reason for it stopping is because her mother and her friends had been praying for many years and she'd been healed. So she understood it as being healed. the psychiatrist interpreted it as that she had been misdiagnosed. So you have to work out which, somewhere in the midst of that lies some truth. But what's interesting is this. She talks a lot about the way in which she's glad no longer to have these experiences that we call schizophrenia. She doesn't like the unpleasant voices, she doesn't like the feeling of being deluded and feelings of being dissociated from the world, and everything that goes along with that way of experiencing things. But there was one voice, she says, that I really miss. And she talks about her as Mary, and she talks about this, that she had a really strong relationship with this voice. She was a friend. This voice was part of her social circle. And when the schizophrenia left her for whatever reason, she was bereft. She had to grieve. And the problem for her was that people couldn't understand why it was that she was having to grieve for somebody that never existed in the first place then. Now my point in that story is very simple. Even symptoms have meaning. And if you simply reduce everything to neurobiology or reduce everything to a symptom of an illness which is meaningless, then you miss that which is profoundly important. Even those people that don't exist are important. If you take time to slow down, if you take time to listen, and if you begin your journey in a slightly different place, you can see that these experiences begin to be transformative of the way we understand people. And just if you want to follow through on that, you should have a look at the Hearing Voices Network, because something like between 3 and 13% of the population, depending on what you look at, of the non-psychiatric population hear voices. In other words, many people within our society hear voices and live well with voices. So once you break it down, maybe it depends who you tell, of course. So hearing voice in itself isn't particularly unusual. It's the way in which they're interpreted and the way in which they're lived with. So, what then is disability? And of course the answer to that question is disability isn't anything. It's simply a way of marking difference, it's a way of naming difference, and sometimes we have to use it for lots of different purposes. In terms of politics, we need it as a way of campaigning. In terms of economics, we may need it as a way of accessing benefits, as a way of marking out difference. We may use it as a way of stigmatizing. It's all sorts of things to all sorts of people. But this is how I'd like to think about it, because basically it's a marker of this. It's a way of naming difference. And I want to suggest to you that one way to think about it is by asking the question, what does it mean to be a human body, a human being who lives within a human body? In the Genesis account of creation again, and Genesis is really interesting in the things it throws up in terms of our understanding of disability. You get that wonderful picture in the second account of the creation, whereby God creates Adam out of the dust and blows his spirit, his nephesh, into him. Once the nephesh is into him, he's alive, he's enlivened, and completely and always sustained by God. So the Spirit of God, in that sense, sustains human beings, makes them alive and not dead. So the Lord God formed man out of dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. St. Augustine describes human beings as terra animata, as animated earth. That our bodies, the physicality of our bodies and the spirituality of our bodies are inextricably intertwined. We're ensouled human beings. Not body and soul, but ensouled, held together in life through the very breath of God. So that's right, human beings are thus seen to be created from matter, but inspired, given breath, brought into living existence by the very breath of God. So we are our bodies and we are our souls. And there's something important and beautiful about that, because if you look around this room, in all of our diversity, we have exactly the same experience. We're sustained and ensouled by God, by the very breath of God. If that's right, then every moment that we have together is in a real sense a holy moment. Every encounter we have with one another is an encounter that is inspired by the Spirit of God. Now, if we begin to think of one another in that way, it's pretty amazing. I mean, take a glance at the person beside you, and it's horrible to do that. But look at the person beside you. You know, these are holy people, sustained by God in a beautiful and wonderful way. So as earth animated by the breath of God, human beings are seen to be holy creatures living among other holy creatures in a world that is holy, right? Now that means your body's holy. That means your body, Paul talks about the body being the temple of the Holy Spirit, but your very bodyliness is sustained by God, so therefore your body is holy. Every body is holy. So attending to God's creatures is in fact a mode of attending to God. So when we attend to one another properly, when we recognize one another as holy creatures and that these bodies that we inhabit are holy places, then beautiful things begin to emerge. Because we begin to realize that the diversity of bodies within creation isn't a stigmatic mark of something negative, but is actually a beautiful thing that draws us together. There's a British practical theologian called John Hull. Now, John Hull writes a lot about the theology of blindness. He is a man who went blind in his 50s. And in his book, Touching the Rock, and in a number of different papers, he describes in great detail the experience of becoming blind. And the first thing that he notices is, in order to adjust to his blindness, he has to, first of all, to make a major adjustment to the way that he sees himself. He says that when I first became blind, that the biggest problem that I had was that I wasn't really a blind person. I was a sighted person who'd lost his sight. He says it wasn't until I became a blind person and allowed myself to encounter the world, not in terms of that which I've lost, but in terms of that which I am, that I was able to understand the nature of blindness in that way. And he talks about the way in which his body encounters the world in a different way through his blindness. So as sighted people, we always assume that the world is out there, to be grasped, to be looked at, to be touched, and to be perceived in a very particular way. But what John Hull notices, once he began to lose his sight, that way of knowing the world was no longer available to him. So at first he felt that he was trapped inside his body, that all of the things that he knew and understood about the world were out there and now inaccessible to him. But then over time, as he became a blind person in that sense, he began to recognize the world was different. And colours began to be different because people had described them to him. Sounds began to be different because they meant different things. He had no idea what they were. When a sound happens, it disappears. For some of us who can see, sounds have sources. There was no source to sound. His hands became no longer simply instrumental things that were picking things up. They became sensory ways of sensing the world, ways of feeling and touching the world. And what he discovered very quickly was, as a sighted person, he had always assumed that that was the only way that you can see the world. But as a blind person, he realized there are multiple ways of understanding and seeing the world. And indeed, as we engage with our bodies in the world, there are multiple ways of being a human being. He said we tend to have, one of the things that sighted people don't realize is that a sighted perspective in the world is just that. It's a perspective. It's one way of looking at the world. And he kind of suggests that sighted people tend to be colonialists in the sense that they want to have all knowledge comes from sight. But his point is this: the different shapes and forms of our body inform us about the world in different ways. All of us encounter the world in radically different ways through our bodies. Now, can you imagine what it would be like if we took seriously the experience of somebody with a profound intellectual disability and the way in which people encounter the world, not as a sense of loss, but as a way of understanding the world? Could you imagine what it would be like if you took seriously the experience of someone with advanced dementia as encountering the world in a very particular way that tells us something very profound about what it means to be a human being? So rather than thinking about being human as a single thing that we all start to push towards, like Bonhoeffer discovered within the Reich, a single thing that everybody pushes towards, what John Hill's saying is that actually being human has a wide range of possibilities. There are lots of different ways in which we can be human, and it's only when we come together and share in depth and thickness our experience that we can understand what it means to be a human being. And so if we're all so busy trying to make everybody normal and like everybody else, then we actually misunderstand what it means to be a human being. So all of us encounter the world through our bodies. The body is a source of knowledge. We know things through our bodies that we can't know in other ways. And none of us encounter the world in the same way. And there's no point at which we can call it our experience of the world normal. And that's the key. There is no normal way of encountering the world. The normal way you encounter the world is through your body, and that's through diversity. So diversity actually is the norm. And all of our perspectives are just that, perspectives. And when you begin to think about the body in that way, and when you begin to see what, if you like, God's pushing us towards in terms of what it means to be a human being, then a lot of things that we take for granted become dissonant and strange. Because God chooses disabled bodies to carry out the key tasks of the kingdom. Think about this. Moses clearly had a speech impediment. He goes along to God and says, God says to him, go and do this thing. And he says, I can't, because I can't speak properly. I have a stutter or whatever it was he has. And God says, no, go and do it. I'll give you some people to help you, but go and do it. He doesn't say, I'm going to heal you your speech impediment, and then therefore you can go out and do it. He said, go and do it. Use the body you have to do the things that you're called to do. And the same thing you find in Paul's thorn in the flesh. Paul says, I prayed 3 times to get rid of this thorn in the flesh, and you didn't do it, God. So let's have a look and see how your grace can be revealed in my weakness. You know, if Paul, one of probably the most successful missionary of all time, isn't healed, you would presume it's not because he has a lack of faith. There's something else going on in the midst of that. Paul says it's through my brokenness, it's through the differences in my body that I'm able to do what I need to do. And that's profoundly important, because the temptation, particularly in a highly medicalised culture like our own, is always to be pushing the disability, saying, well, we need to fix this, and we need to push this away, and then you transfer that into a religious context, and we say, well, you've got to heal this, and you've got to heal that. That's not at all the way that God seems to work with bodies that are different. It's actually through that difference that glorification begins. And of course, at the heart of our tradition is the disabled body of Jesus on the cross. This is a picture by an artist called Matthias Grunewald. It's part of a triptych that was in a hospice for plague victims. And in that picture, if you can see it close enough, if you go right up to it, you'll see that the body of Christ is pockmarked with marks of the plague. And what he's trying to do is to show that Jesus identifies with human brokenness, with human suffering, with human difference in that way. So right at the heart of our tradition is the broken body of Christ. And indeed, redemption comes through the broken body of Christ. And even in the resurrection, you still have the body of Christ that's somehow scarred, somehow marked in that sense. And so the beauty of brokenness, the beauty of human bodies that are different, is very much respected in tradition rather than changed. Indeed, if it's true that all bodies are holy, then the way that we live on this planet begins to shift and change. So with these provisional ideas and thoughts in mind, I want us to think about really what that looks like. How can we take these understandings and what do they look like? And the way I want to frame it is in terms of time, hospitality, and belonging. Let's begin with time, because time is very, very important. I don't know if you've noticed, but most of our lives is ruled by time. You know, we use time in precisely the way that we use our money. We buy time, we waste time, we stock time, we do everything you do with your cash, you do with your money. And in a capitalist society where everything is kind of works along the same principle, it's not surprising that time becomes highly problematic. And indeed, it oppresses us. First thing in the morning, actually I was working it out today. Before I got to the bathroom, I saw 8 clocks. On my iPad, on my phone, on the television, on the kettle, and on the something else. Yes, my alarm clock. I don't know if that's 8, but there were 8, I counted them. Why do you need 8 clocks in a room that's about the size of this desk? So there's something weird about time, and something weird about the way we use time. His Confessions has a big section on the nature of time, which is very interesting. He's trying to work out how God can be timeless and eternal, and yet for time still to exist. And so some of his challengers ask, well, what was God doing before he created the world? And people would say things like, creating hell for the sinners, or something of that ilk, or some derivation of that. And Augustine wasn't happy with that way of looking at things. And his conclusion was that when God creates the world, he creates time. And so time comes into existence when the world comes into existence. When the world falls, when creation falls, time falls. So time is a creature, in the same way as you and I. When creation falls, time falls too. So it becomes oppressive. And he suggests that, well, this is my interpretation, that the essence of what we need to do with time as Christians is to redeem time and put it to its proper purposes. In other words, to cease to allow time to remain in its fallen state and to bring it to a place where its proper purposes are revealed. Now you think about that in terms of something like dementia care. One of the in the research that we have done on spirituality and disability, one of the things that people always say is, yeah, I think spirituality is really, really important, but we just don't have time to do it. In the midst of all the busyness of the world, the world of work, we don't have time to do it. And there's something profoundly wrong with that if we don't have time to do very basic things. And if you think about it in the context of dementia care, one of the things that you notice very quickly when you're working alongside people with dementia is that you need to slow down. You need to slow down, and you need to take time, as Stanley Hauerwas puts it, for those things that the world considers to be trivial. Small gestures, small looks. But when you do that, and sometimes wonderful things happen. You know, I don't know if you've ever been with a person with dementia when suddenly, in an instant, you catch them or they catch you. And for that instant, the two of you are there, locked together, in a space that's really not available in other places. It can happen at any kind of time. It can happen in a worship service, it can happen in the toilet, it can happen in the day room. Wherever it happens, you capture that moment. And it always reminds me of the spiritual tradition of the sacrament of the present moment. The idea that we need to recognize that each moment is given to us, and to be able to slow down, and to be able to value every second that's given to us, every breath that's given to us in God through his nephesh, every aspect of our life to slow down. When you work alongside people whose lives need slowness, then everything, you can see exactly what Augustine means when he says, redeem time. But if you're too fast, you're going to miss that. I think people miss that in terms of dementia care. I think we all miss that a lot, in the sense that we're so fast and so much to do and so many movements to make that we miss the beauty of the present moment. And one of the places where I learned to see that and put the importance of slowing down and finding moments is in the times that I've spent within the large communities, and in particular the times I've spent with Jean Vanier, and I've learned a lot from him over the years. Now, at the beginning of the year, I got an email from Jean Vanier saying that I've been asked to write a book on mental illness, but I don't know anything about mental illness. So could you help me? I said, well, I know a little bit about mental illness. Yes, I said. And so I went across to Trolley at the beginning of the year and began to do some work on this book with Jean. And it's always a pleasure to go to Trolley. But the thing that struck me was this. I don't speak French. And everybody, because it's in France, inconsiderately speaks French. So but the first thing I noticed, though, and I always notice it, is how incapacitated that is. Because, for example, I would sit with meals with people, and I had no idea what was going on. I had a lot of things I wanted to say. I couldn't say them. Not because they weren't important, but because we didn't have the means of communication. So I felt truly alienated and excluded, not because they were alienated and excluding me, but just because my mode of communication just didn't do the job in that situation. And I always sensed the frustration of non-verbal people in that sense, because that's exactly what it must feel like. You have a lot to say, and just haven't got the space to say it. But towards the end of my trip there, we went to one of the units called Le Forestier, which is where people with profound and complex intellectual disabilities are. People who are non-verbal in the way that they communicate. There are plenty of ways to do communicate. And I was sitting there feeling lost at the dinner table. And everybody was doing their jobs and they were clearing the table. And eventually it came to a situation where, or the position where there was just me, Jean, and a young lady who, 40-something lady, which is very young the older I get, sitting around this table. And I was watching Jean, and he sat with her, and he just looked at her. And she looked at him, and then she looked away. And then her hand began to kind of move like this, rhythmically. And eventually, after a few moments, Jean put his hand on top of her hand. And together they really found a rhythm. And then she turned her eyes towards Jean, and they locked together, right? And so there was this beautiful rhythm of her hand and this wonderful engagement of Jean with this young lady who he knew well, but was focusing in on. And it struck me that was just such a beautiful picture of presence. In order to be present with somebody, you don't have to say anything. You just have to be in the rhythm of their lives. And that takes time, and that takes a creation of a particular type of space within which both of you can begin to engage. In that space between them, you can see love and respect, even though that love and respect could never be articulated. And in that kind of context, I can see exactly what St. Augustine meant when he said redeem time. To slow down, to find the rhythm of the other, to find the beauty in the other, and to gracefully be able to be together in the midst of a place where there are no words, which to me is just a beautiful picture of the way that we should all be with one another. Because we do spend too much time talking, and we spend not enough time engaging in these deep, graceful, and rhythmic ways. So the second theme that I want us to think about in relation to what I've been talking about has to do with hospitality. This is a picture of St. Francis. It's a painting of St. Francis before he became Pope. And it's a very evocative picture in this sense, because what you see is one of the most powerful religious men on the planet kneeling down and kissing the feet of this young man who was dying of AIDS. And the humility in that is beautiful. The bodily posture in that picture is beautiful. And the fact and the tragedy of this young man's life is brought into sharp focus as the engagement of Francis here gives his, what will be a short life, deep, deep meaning. But there's more to it than that, because what you really see is Francis offering to become a guest in the house of this young man. Now, think about it this way. One of the things that we maybe don't always notice in the life of Jesus is the way that sometimes he's a guest and sometimes he's a host. So it's that constant hospitable movement from guest to host that marks the life of Jesus. Now, to be a guest in somebody's house means that you're just there because you're invited to be there. You know, if you're a guest in somebody's house, you don't take along a pot of paint so you can paint the living room the same colour as your own. You're there because you want to learn, because you've been invited, because you're a guest in the midst of that. And that's what the essence of hospitality is. What would it be like if all of us, instead of thinking that we are hosts in particular situations, were quite comfortable to be guests? What would it be like to be a guest in the house of a person with advanced dementia? What's it like to be a guest in the house of a person with cystic fibrosis? What's it like to be a guest in the house of someone with a profound intellectual disability? Rather than thinking we have to host and do things, what happens if we just sit down and listen around and listen to what's going on? And allow that knowledge to transform both of us, all of us. Because that's kind of what John Hull is talking about. We need to be guests in one another's houses before we can have any idea what it means to encounter the world in a body that's different from yours or different from one another. So hospitality, I think, is the fundamental principle in terms of faithful community building. Unless we can become hospitable to one another and be able to guest in one another's houses and guest in one another's lives, then we can't possibly be faithful in the things that we strive to do. So hospitality and the rhythm of hospitality is fundamental for timeful living. And as I come towards the end of what I want to talk to you about, let me illustrate that idea of guesting and the experience of a young lady that we worked alongside for some time. A couple of years ago, and it's an ongoing project, we managed to get some funding to do a project exploring the spiritual lives of people with profound and complex intellectual disabilities, people who don't have language as the first mode of communication. And we spent a lot of time with people with that kind of life experience and their families, beginning to explore what spirituality meant, what it looks like, and what it felt like in that way of encountering one another. Elizabeth's story will illustrate this idea of guesting, because underlying what we want to do is to try and really to be a guest in people's houses and have a look around. Now, Elizabeth had a profound intellectual disability. She also had cerebral palsy, and she was also blind. She was also a Quaker, and she was very engaged with the Quaker community. And so we went to visit her, both at home and at the Quaker community, just to try to get a sense of the way in which she experienced the world, and the way in which she experienced her spiritual life. And one of the interesting things about Elizabeth is this. She had no words, but she was able to transform. And I'll come back to that in a second. And amongst the other issues that Elizabeth was experiencing, she recently, this was about 4 years ago, was diagnosed with leukemia. And so she ended up in hospital, and she was getting various tests. And when they discovered that she had leukemia, her mother went into the room where she was and said to her, "Elizabeth, you have leukemia." And immediately, Elizabeth started to cry. Now, I would be very surprised if she understood the meaning of the word leukemia, but something happened. Okay, so a second story. When we went to the Quaker Hall to talk to our community and to begin to try to understand their spirituality, they began to talk very fondly of her. Within Quakerism, all children are part of their community, and so there's no problem with whether somebody should be baptised or not baptised. Everybody was just part of the community. And she says, well, there's something fascinating about the way that Elizabeth encounters her worship. Now, at the heart of the Quaker worship, as many of you will know, is silence. Silence is the essence of good worship within Quakerism. And this woman said to her as well, watch what happens with Elizabeth when she engages. And so the community gathered around her, and they went into their meditative silence. Now, in the middle of the room, Elizabeth was there, and on that day she was quite distressed, quite upset, and quite noisy. But as the community went into their deep silence, she began to move into that silence. She began to calm down, she began to engage, and after a few moments, she was just part of that community. That community of silence kind of seemed to engulf her, and she was part of that. She was peaceful, she was still, and she was engaging with what was going on. That's two stories about Elizabeth. What's the commonalities between them? Well, the first story about leukemia, I don't think she would have known what leukemia meant, but she understood her mother's anxiety. And anxiety transfers. So she comes into the room, you have leukemia, Elizabeth senses that, takes that on board, becomes upset. Because our emotions don't belong to ourselves. Our emotions are shared between one another. If you're ever with somebody who's anxious, you can be guaranteed that later on you'll be anxious. And in the second context, in terms of worship, same thing. As her community engaged in spiritual silence, so that spiritual silence drew her in, made her part of something that was bigger than she was herself, and enabled her in that sense to fully participate within that spirituality. In other words, and this is probably the thing to learn, we tend to think that our spirituality is a personal thing, particularly in a kind of postmodern context where everything's to do with self-actualization. But actually our spirituality is always a common thing, always something that we do together. And Elizabeth's experience brings that to light. And by sitting within her experience and allowing her to, in that sense, enable us to see something different. So we move from hosts who thought we were doing things for Elizabeth to guests who learned something profoundly important about the nature of human spirituality, and that is, we do it together. We always do it together. And so that's an example of the way in which sitting as a guest, accepting hospitality, begins to open up new possibilities. And this is the last thing that I want to say to you. And it relates to inclusion. We talk a lot about inclusion, and there's a very strong political movement towards including people with disabilities within our communities. Now, that's enshrined in law. For example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, you may well have a similar act here. We have the Disability Rights Act in the UK, which means that from a legal point of view, people with disabilities have to be in the room. Right? So it's not possible, it's not legal not to have people in the room. But once you get in the room, nobody cares. You don't have to care, you just have to get people in the room. And so, you can be included, and that's great, but, if nobody talks to you, then there's not a point. And I was speaking at a conference in Edinburgh not so long ago, and I was talking about mental illness, and I was talking about the biblical idea of shalom, whereby the Bible doesn't have any word for health in the way that we understand it. It's got this idea of shalom, which is basically righteousness, holiness, and right relationship with God. So to be healthy is to be in right relationship with God, irrespective of what your body or your mind may be saying to you at that moment in time. And I went to the toilet afterwards, and this guy followed me to the toilet. Normally I'd be disturbed, but in this case it was interesting. And he said to me, I never thought about what you were saying. I said, I never realised that I was as accepted just the way that I am. I always thought that I was a bad Christian. I've had a mental health problem all my life. I thought, to be included within the community, but at the same time not to feel accepted is you may as well not be included. So this is how I'd like us to frame it. To be included, you simply have to be there, but to belong, you need to be missed. You need to have a space within your community that is for you. That when you're not there, people miss you, people long for you in the same way as the prodigal son longs for his father, longs for the prodigal son. You have to have a space within which you're noticed and within which you're missed. And in order to do that, you have to have a particular type of community, which is not simply an inclusive community, important as inclusion is, but a community within which people in all the different shapes and forms and beauties and beautiful bodies and beautiful bodily shapes are accepted exactly as they are and have a place of belonging and hopefulness in the midst of a world that really does like to exclude people or try to make them beautiful according to the standards that culture has decided as beauty should be judged. So a community of belonging is a community of beauty, of proper inclusion, and a place where you have a space that can never be filled by anybody else. So to conclude, I would suggest that the task of the church is not necessarily world transformation. That's God's task. The task of the church is signalling the kingdom through small gestures. And these small gestures involve naming things properly, understanding the nature of hospitality, accepting the beauty of all bodies in all the different shapes and forms, and indeed the holiness of bodies in all different shapes and forms, and working together to create communities of belonging within which you can be proud to be both a guest and to be a host. Thank you for listening.